You're listening to the Gangland History Podcast, rigorously researched history that brings the American mob to life, one true story at a time. Hello, everybody, and welcome into the Gangland History Podcast. As I said in the opening of the episode, I'm your host, Jacob Stoops, and we've got a special episode today. A special guest, author Scott Deitche, joins us. Scott, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you. So for those of you that are familiar with the mob genre, I'm going to guess that you've read Scott's work. For those of you that may not know, or may not be familiar with the genre or may not know Scott, Scott is the author of 11 different titles, soon to be 12. And he's probably the foremost expert on the Trafficante crime family out of Tampa. And that's going to be our focus today. Scott, in 2005, this is going back 20 years now, wrote the book Cigar City Mafia, A Complete History of the Tampa Underworld. He also wrote a book on Santo Trafficante himself, the Silent Don. He's written books on the New Jersey Mafia, Garden State Gangland. He wrote a book called Hitman, the Mafia, Drugs in the East Harlem Purple Gang, among others. So definitely go out. You can find all of those books on Amazon or on Scott's website. I actually just finished reading Cigar City Mafia earlier this year. It's actually timely that Scott and I got together, and we got together by chance. The Xavier Ebele interview kind of spurred Scott to reach out to me, and we made the connection and decided to do an episode together. So excited to have you, Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
So we're going to start at the beginning, and no pressure, Scott, but I feel like if there's anybody that can talk about this stuff probably all day, it's probably you. So, for the listeners, you're about to get an education on the Tampa mob. It's, again, one of those underreported and under-talked about families. Unless you're talking about Santo Trafficante Jr., most people don't know about the rest of Tampa, right? So Santo's the big name, and also his father. But there's a lot more history there and a lot of meat on the bone, as they say. So why don't we start in the early days? So we'll start, pre-mob, Italian immigration, right? So at the late 19th century and early 20th century, a large number of Italians began immigrating to Tampa. And I guess the question that I would ask is, how did the arrival of lots of Italians in the late 1800s and early 1900s shape Tampa, as well as suburbs or cities that are close by, like Ybor City and West Tampa?
Yeah, so the predominant Italian immigration to Ybor City neighborhood of Tampa, and Tampa in general, is Sicilian, from Sicily. Mostly a few different cities like Alessandria della Rocca, or the villages, I should say, Santo Stefano. And a lot of the Sicilian immigration was spurred on by the growth of the cigar industry in Tampa. So you had kind of a pretty unique mix of ethnicities, especially for the Deep South, post Civil War era. You had a large Cuban, Spanish population. Uh, you had immigration a little bit from Germany, Romania, and the large Sicilian population. So probably the Sicilian and Cuban immigration to Ybor, along with the Spanish, they were kind of the three primary ethnic groups that started migrating probably in the mid 1880s in through the early part of the 20th century into Tampa. And
And then,
well,
well,
go ahead. I'm
yeah,
sorry.
I was going to ask why is Tampa the epicenter for the cigar industry? I had to ask that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a cigar maker, Vincente M. Ybor, and he had a cigar factory in Key West. There are a few reasons he was looking to relocate. Found some land outside downtown Tampa, which had just started coming into its own as a city. But it had a railroad. It had the plant railroad, so it had really good connectivity. So if you were producing a product like cigars that you needed to get out to your customers, having really a good rail link was important. The humidity, was advantageous, like Key West or Cuba for making cigars. So when Ybor started the cigar industry, one of the interesting things he did is he asked a bunch of other cigar makers if they wanted to relocate, and then actually built and sold housing for his workers to kind of grow the community. At its height, there was over 200 cigar factories in Tampa, tens of millions of cigars coming out. So that's kind of how it's still to this day known as Cigar City, even though it doesn't have 200 factories making cigars. It's still probably, probably best known for the cigar heritage that it has, for sure.
Yeah, and it's of all the families that eventually developed in terms of the mafia, I think it's the one that has the most, what I'll just call like Latin American Spanish influence. And so, how did this kind of cultural mix shape the early underworld in Tampa as it was evolving?
Yeah, that's a good question because it's different than, Boston or New York City or Chicago. You had a much different ethnic mix. But, at the end of the day, you're always going to have a certain type of, segment of any society that gravitates towards that criminal element. Um, and really the thing in Ybor and especially Tampa for crime figures and people in the underworld, there were a few things. You had illegal gambling, which was big, and there was a game called Bolita, which was introduced to the United States through Ybor. That becomes big money. You have Port Tampa, which is right, very close to Havana, Cuba. So even through the Prohibition era, you have a very lucrative smuggling route, not only for illegal alcohol, but for narcotics and illegal immigrants. So human smuggling was really big. So you have a couple of these different elements that are going on at the same time that kind of spur the growth of the criminal underworld in Tampa. And you have a little bit of a mix. You have Cuban criminals, Spanish criminals, then you have this burgeoning um, Sicilian mafia family that emerges in Ybor, already has ties to Kansas City, New Orleans, New York. So all that starts coming up around the same time. And you already have a crime boss in Tampa who's not any of those aforementioned groups. So it's kind of an interesting mix how that grows.
Yeah, so why don't we get into that? That's what everybody's here for. So, why don't we talk about the outgrowth of the mafia and how they eventually, of course, settled in Tampa and formed an organization within Tampa. So, like you mentioned, it's not any of the names you probably recognize. So, who was that first boss that really started, or at least the first recognized boss that we know of for what became the modern day Trafficante family?
Yeah, so you start seeing the emergence of Black Hand activity in Ybor around the early 1900s. Um, and some of the names that start emerging, there are a few, maybe people that follow the mafia might know like the last name Arcuri. Joe Arcuri was
Yeah.
consigliere for the Gambinos, during the Gotti
Yeah.
era. He was born in Tampa. His family traces back to Tampa. There's a branch of the Manganos from New York that were in Tampa. So there was already a little bit of that connectivity, but by the time that the mafia starts emerging, probably there might have been a boss or two before, we don't really know, but probably the first real recognizable boss was Ignazio Italiano. And he was boss throughout the Prohibition era in 1920s. He dies in 1930, but during the Hotel Statler meeting, which was this early meeting of bootleggers and gangland figures up in Cleveland, Ohio, Ignazio Italiano and another Tampa member there representing Tampa. So already by 1928, they're considered, one of the families.
Yeah, and that the Hotel Statler meeting, which is up in my neck of the woods. I'm an Ohio guy, so up in Cleveland, was a lot of people forget that meeting occurred. I think a lot of people tend to talk about the Atlantic City meeting, which I believe was 1929, right as the Castellammarese War was kicking off. The meeting that happens after the Castellammarese War, when they kind of lay down the new rules and regulations after both Masseria and Maranzano are murdered. And then, of course, people think of the Appalachian meeting, but there was this Hotel Statler meeting. There was another kind of national meeting in Boston, again around this time. And I think both of these meetings had some very significant players. Although if you go and look at the roster, there are plenty of people on there that maybe you don't know, but they were big players. And the Italianos were definitely among them. There's another Italiano that I think we'll talk about in a little bit, but it does show that there was a national conglomerate already forming well before 1931, which I find interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I didn't have this kind of in my list of pre-planned questions, but of course we do have to talk about not just Velita and the gambling, but how big was the Tampa family when it came to prohibition? Was that like everywhere else, a huge source of revenue and growth for the family?
Yeah, absolutely. Florida was a hotbed all across the state. So it wasn't just the mafia guys, it was all the other organized crime criminals that were making their money in bootlegging. But the Sicilian mafia in Tampa definitely were one of the bigger gangs involved in bootlegging at that time. And almost all of that was coming out of Cuba.
Yeah, interesting. And the Tampa family, Cuba was just a natural place for them. Many of them were known to speak Spanish. Santo Trafficante Senior, paramount among them. And so, with that fact, and of course having to blend, with the different ethnicities in Tampa, you pretty much had to be fluent not just in Italian and English, but also Spanish. So it doesn't surprise me that Cuba was kind of a hotbed for importing booze from Prohibition. One of the things that, as I was reading your book, that surprised me was the level of fragmentation, not just, with the different ethnic groups in Tampa, but even within the Italian group in Tampa. And maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the sense that I got as you got through the 20s and the 30s was that, unlike other cities, there was not a single Italian group, like one group that would form one family. It seemed as if there were several Italian groups operating in and around Tampa. And this does remind me of some other cities in the 1920s, right? Chicago had not just the outfit, but several Italian groups, which eventually got consolidated very violently. Detroit was another place. Philadelphia was another place that I can think of off the top of my head, where it wasn't just the modern day mafia family that we know operating there. There was a need for violent consolidation. And so I guess the question is, did that happen also in Tampa? Because that's the sense I got when I was reading your book.
Yeah, so there were a few different kind of strong groups. There was the Diecidue family, there was the Antinoris, there were the Italianos, there were the Trafficantes. There wasn't as it's funny in the 1930s there was a big Tampa Mafia war, but it was primarily between the Italians, some of the Cubans, and this probably the first real organized crime kingpin in Tampa, this guy named Charlie Wall. So the first mob war wasn't really be internal between the different factions. There was some not getting along and interesting
Yeah.
warfare, internal warfare, a little bit early on. But funny enough, it isn't until 1950 when Santo Trafficante Jr. starts to take over for his father that there's really an internal war where you have this one faction led by Salvatore Italiano and then the Trafficantes who start fighting each other. So to your point, yeah, it is like some other families. Their kind of little internal strife came a little bit, later, but not unlike like the Profaci family in New York or these other New York families that have kind
Yeah.
of these internal splits. So no, I think your assessment is right. They were all kind of lumped together, but there were definitely some different factions at times.
Yeah, definitely. And they, from what I saw, they didn't truly become kind of one entity until you got into the 1950s and everything was a little more consolidated. So before we get there, though, there's something that's referred to as the era of blood, which I find and I don't know who coined this, but it's sounds pretty badass. Violent, violent. You don't hear that in other cities, despite the fact that, of course, there was a lot of violence in other cities. But can you tell us about the era of blood from the 30s to the 40s?
Yeah, so it was coined by Tampa newspaper. Tampa, maybe it was the Tampa Times, not the Tampa Bay Times of now, but there was a paper back in that time. Anyway, so it was kind of the name the journalists gave to this period. And really, it was a war between the mafia as they started consolidating their power and Charlie Wall and his organization. And you had some independent Cuban criminals and Spanish criminals that got kind of caught up in the mix. So there was probably anywhere from 30 to 35 killings and probably as many acts of violence, shootings, attempted shootings. And basically, they were all vying for control of Bolita and the narcotics and the other rackets that were going on in town. And, keeping in mind, Tampa at this time, the city itself maybe had 50, 60,000 people total. And, the greater metro area now is,
Yeah.
2.5 million. It was, much smaller back then. So, you're like, oh, that doesn't seem that many compared to Chicago. Well, Chicago's significantly larger. So because there was this gangland violence in a smaller city, it made a lot of national news. They were calling Tampa Little Chicago. There's an article about it. They called it the hellhole of the Gulf Coast. So it definitely kind of shaped some of the perception of Tampa in the 1930s. And
Yeah, for sure. That when you think of the
yeah,
population, like you said, it's much different than it is now. But the murder rate per capita was pretty high. So I want to talk about a few names from that era, and we'll bounce around. We'll start with the Italians, and maybe you can just talk about who they were, what ultimately happened to them, and kind of where they fit into the picture. So the first one that I'll talk about, and if you've watched any documentaries on Santo, you've probably heard of this guy, Ignazio Antinori. So can you tell us a little bit about him?
yeah, he was, and I do want to correct one thing real quick too. Tampa was a nice city. There wasn't a lot of crime, but there was a lot of the gangland crime. So I don't want the viewers to
Yeah.
take away that Tampa was it was bad. It was really because of this gangland violence. And one of the
Hmm.
main kind of protagonist behind this was Ignazio Antinori. So when Ignazio Italiano dies in 1930, Ignazio Antinori kind of steps up as one of the top heads of organized crime, and he's involved in narcotics. He's involved in Bolita, human smuggling, and he also has pretty close connections with Joe Profaci, who Ignazio Italiano also did. So there was a strong New York connection, and he was kind of butting heads with Charlie Wall. And Ignazio Antinori is kind of at the peak of his power in the 1930s, but in October 22nd, I believe, 1940, he was gunned down. Antinori was gunned down while drinking at a bar on the outskirts of Tampa. Now, he had two sons, Joe and Paul, and they kind of took off where their father left off. And then Joe was gunned down in 1953, and then Paul kind of just left. So that kind of ended the Antinori's reign during that time.
And was that murder engineered by Charlie Wall and his guys?
Yeah, that's kind of the general consensus. But yeah.
Well, let's move to Charlie Wall. An interesting character. Yeah. Charlie would go on to testify in I believe the Kefauver hearings. But before he did that, he was known as, I believe, the Dean of the Underworld was his nickname.
Yeah.
So pretty famous non-Italian gangster in Tampa. So can you tell us a little bit about Mr. Charlie Wall?
Yeah, I would say Charlie was probably one of the most well-known Tampa figures in Tampa history, just because he was really this very. So he grew up the son of one of the most prominent Tampa families. His mother was a McKay, they were like the founding families of Tampa, still very well known. There's McKay stuff everywhere in Tampa. His father was a former mayor, a Civil War hero. So he grew up, pretty well off. His mom died though when he was young. He didn't get along with his stepmom. So anyway, long story short, he ends up kind of on the streets, like in his early 20s. Gets addicted to morphine, starts hanging out in gambling dens. But because he still has all these family connections, he leverages his political connections and the people he knows downtown Tampa, and he starts kind of taking control. And by the mid-1920s, he's really starting to get pretty powerful, controls Bolita, has his hand in politics, has his hand in narcotics. And kind of the interesting thing is he has this, this pretty big crew of Sicilians and Cubans and Spanish guys that are under him. But he was born and raised in Tampa, so he's like that homegrown Tampa criminal. And I think the reason he's kind of so popular is because during the 1930s, during this era of blood, he was shot at 3 separate times and escaped assassination all 3 times. So he kind of developed this mythical status over the years. There's been a great book about him, White Shadow, a novel. There's been a documentary I was interviewed for. There's been plays written about him. He's like still to this day a character that a lot of people that grew up in Tampa, they know the name Charlie Wall.
And he was I feel like somewhat flamboyant for the era, loud, boisterous. And the interesting thing is he was not raised in a family where you would tend to go into this sort of a lifestyle. He was one of those that he must have just liked the action, so to speak, and didn't want to go kind of the straight and narrow path that was laid before him. And he eventually gets forced out of the rackets in the 40s prior to testifying in the Kefauver hearings. So how does that happen?
It's basically, by the time Ignazio Antinori dies, Charlie's in a weakened state. His top 2 lieutenants, Tito Rubio, Eddie Varela, they get killed. Some of his other guys get killed. His power starts to wane. The police are on to some of the operations and things. So long story short, Santo Trafficante kind of steps in the picture around 1940, and the father, Santo Senior. Yeah, I'll be clear on that, Santo Senior. And he basically kind of Charlie Walt says he kind of gets pushed out of the rackets. And the story I've heard from people, including a couple cops at the time, is Santo kind of gave this order of protection, and he said, "Hey, you stay the hell away from everything, and we're good. Nothing will happen to you," kind of thing. But Charlie Walt kept kind of poking the bear. He testifies in front of the Kefauver hearings. Nothing necessarily earth shattering, but the fact that he testifies, still living in Tampa, nothing happens to him. He starts by the early 1950s. He's older. He's in the 70s. He's going around to these mob run bars, getting drunk and bad mouthing people, and just becoming kind of a nuisance. And he's built up all these grudges. And on the night of April 18th, 1955, he's drinking in a Trafficante bar called the Dream Bar. He gets a ride home from this gangster, Nick Scaglione. Nick drops him off, goes back to the bar. And 2 days later, his wife comes home from visiting her sister and walks to the back room of their house. And there's Charlie with his throat cut and his head smashed in. And it's still to this day a unsolved cold case for Tampa PD. But I spoke to some of the officers that were involved in it. A couple of them since passed, but it was they kind of pretty much knew it was a mob hit, and it was somebody he knew that he led into the house. So, but who exactly that was, there some names have floated around over the years, but anyone who was involved in it is long gone at this point.
It was one of the more brutal scenes as far as I remember hearing it described. So it was he was killed by somebody with a grudge.
Yes.
And very very bad intent. So that's 1955. From a timeline standpoint, Santo Sr. He passes in around 1950 or 51. 54.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah,
he
passes in August of 54, which coincidentally he dies at kind of order of stay away from Charlie, and then 8 months later Charlie Walt's gone. So
right, and so that brings me, I want to talk a little bit about Salvatore Red Italiano, right? So let's the path is laid after Santo Sr. for his son, and we'll talk plenty about Santo Jr. But his son takes over, and you had mentioned the infighting with Salvatore Red Italiano. So how does that happen? Because that I believe happens before Charlie Walt gets murdered, or right around the same time.
Yeah, so you can probably trace that back to June 1950, when Jimmy Lumia, who's really a top guy in the mafia, the FBI called him a boss. I don't think he ever was really the boss, but he might have been overseeing kind of a large faction. He was pretty powerful. He gets gunned down in broad daylight down by the port of Tampa. His iconic photo. It's the cover of my book, Cigar Mafia. Yeah, I mean, it's a iconic Tampa
right
crime
there.
photo. And he's aligned with Salvatore Red Italiano. Now, Red Italiano leaves Tampa because he's subpoenaed for the Kefauver hearings, but he's also kind of jockeying for power. There's this kind of faction that's going. They don't like the fact that Santo Sr.'s handing it to Santo Jr. So over the next few years, there's some internal fighting. Santo Jr. himself gets shot in the arm in January of 53. Joe Antinori, who I mentioned before, Ignazio's son, gets killed in 1953. There's another guy, Paul Ferraro, who's part of the Italiano faction. He gets shot at and then goes into hiding. So there's kind of this bloodshed over a few years. Internals kind of ironing out, the wrinkles in the family dynamics. And then, by the mid to late 50s, there's still a few more murders that happen, but most of the internal strife has been quelled, and Trafficante Jr., pretty much goes on as usual as boss.
And the way that I understand it is, prior to leaving, Red Italiano had sent word to Jimmy Lumia, like, hey, you might be in trouble. You should get out of town. And Lumia did not get out of town. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was
Okay.
pretty brazen murder of him too. So
Um, and so let's go back in order to go forward, right? So Santo Senior has been on the in the underworld scene since at least the 20s, right? And he has relationships all the way down in Cuba. And at a certain point, Santo, and I don't remember the year off the top of my head, Santo Jr. is born, and as he grows up, I think Santo Senior sees something in him that says, "Hey, maybe this particular son, and there were multiple sons, is fit for the life, right? He's a leader. He just has the qualities necessary to maybe one day lead the family." And so, tell us how Santo Senior begins to train Santo Junior, kind of on the job.
yeah, so Santo Senior, yeah, so he has five sons. Santo Junior is the second oldest. And there's stories that as he gets a little bit older in his early teens, he starts working with like the Decidues, and they're running some gambling and bolita operations. He gets sent up to New York to kind of be under tutelage under some mobsters that Santos Senior knows up there. But it's interesting if you try to trace some of this stuff back. There's very little on Santos Senior and like how he ran things, what kind of person he was. There's very little. And in those early years of Santo Junior, things really just all of a sudden kind of shoot out of a cannon, like 1948. With the killing of Jimmy Velasco in Tampa, who's this political fixer. Then the Trafficante name starts really leaking out, and people start being like, oh, okay, these are the guys in town. So, yeah, so the 1920s, 1930s of Santo Jr., well, late 20s, early 30s of Santo Jr. is getting a little bit older, starting to come up in through his teens and through his early 20s. There's not a ton of information in like actual like law enforcement reports, so it's more under the radar. But yeah, he kind of emerges fully formed, if you will, by the time the newspapers start identifying him. So yeah, it was kind of the way he was groomed up, and all of his other brothers that in some sense were involved, whether it was through the bar industry or gambling. But yeah, Santo Jr. definitely was kind of if you use the Godfather reference, the Michael of the family, kind of rises to the top.
Yeah, he's the one that has all the right qualities. In to look at him, he looks like a school
Yeah,
teacher.
it definitely does not
quite
look like
frankly.
the stereotypical mobster, that's for sure.
Yeah, there are some mugshots of him where he is legitimately scary looking, but in most pictures you see of him, he looks like this unassuming figure. But behind it all, just like Michael in The Godfather, he was as ruthless as anybody in the country, and one of the better bosses for a long time. In Cosa Nostra nationally. So his first order of business, pretty much, is take care of Charlie Wall and iron out a few other things in the 1950s with respect to purging in his family and in the Tampa underworld. Santo, who, as I mentioned, the Traficantes spoke fluent Spanish. So they started going down to Cuba quite early as the 1920s. So I'm assuming that, as the 50s ramp up, the Cuban connection ramps up with the connection, of course, probably at that time to Fulgencio Batista, who was in power in Cuba. But then, of course, Castro comes along. So can you tell us a little bit about the Traficantes and the Cuban connection?
Yeah, so by the 1950s, post World War II, the tourism economy really starts to boom again, and Cuba is the beneficiary of its proximity to the United States, specifically Florida. So you had multiple daily flights going out of Tampa and Miami to Cuba. It became a popular tourist destination. So as the hotel infrastructure starts to grow on the island, the mafia has already been going there. They already have connections there. So they really started expanding their offerings. And so I would, well, let's go down the list of hotels. So the ones that Trafficante were involved in, he had the Deauville. He ran that with a Cuban gangster, Evaristos Carlos Garcia. He had an interest in the Havana Hilton. He had an interest in the Hotel Capri. He owned the Sansucci, which is the only of those hotels that I mentioned that's not there today. All the rest are still there. And a few other mob-run casinos around there. There was the Plaza, which was kind of more downtown Havana, and then there was the famous Hotel Nacional, whose casino was run by Lansky. Trafficante was seen there many times. And they actually brought in Wilbur Clark from Las Vegas to run the casino there. So there was a lot of not only power with Trafficante and guys like Meyer Lansky, but a lot of interconnectivity with the different families. They all kind of, they all got along down there because they were all there making a lot of money.
Yeah, and did that era, the mid to late 40s going into the 50s and the 60s, was really the era of the mafia and casinos, not just in the United States, but Cuba, as we just mentioned. They were making big bets on casinos. Trafficante, they did have points in Las Vegas in some casinos, didn't they? Or was that just the other families, the Chicagos and the Kansas Cities?
One of the great misses of Trafficante's career is, especially post-Cuba, post-Castro, he did not invest much in Vegas and kind of kept trying to get back into the Caribbean. Whereas the other families who were always involved there, but much more so. And I would say Tampa was probably one of the least involved families in Vegas because of that. So a missed opportunity.
Super surprising.
Probably a good business lesson.
Yeah. So you mentioned Lansky, and in your book, I've read a couple of other books. For whatever reason, I got a sense that I don't know that there was maybe a dislike, but like a certain level of like competition at some point with Lansky before there was eventually cooperation. So, what was the relationship like with Lansky?
From what I've read and what I've heard from people, they weren't friends. They were kind of business acquaintances. They didn't mesh particularly, but they were cordial to each other, and there wasn't any real animosity. Sometimes you hear stuff where they'll knock on each other behind their back, but that could just be wise guy stuff. But for the most part, they didn't work together a lot, but they worked side by side, if that makes any sense. Like they were always like doing their own stuff, and certainly post Castro, when Trafficante comes back to the U.S., he moves to Miami basically full time for quite a while, and runs into Lansky and is seen with Lansky a few times. But so yeah, they weren't the best of friends by any means.
Yeah, you mentioned Miami. As I've done a lot of research, obviously there wasn't a family in Miami, but there was a huge multi-family presence down in Miami, and it always surprised me. There's guys like Carlo Gambino showed up in Miami on surveillance reports many times. Angelo Bruno, sometimes Gambino and Bruno together spent time in Miami. Tony Salerno spent time in Miami. Of course, Meyer Lansky was down in Miami for quite some time. So you would think that the Trafficantes would have Florida as a whole, as a state, on lockdown. So what was the relationship with the other families who definitely had activities going on in the state of Florida, and specifically Miami? There was definitely a presence from all over the country there.
Yeah, and you mentioned Angelo Bruno. Trafficante was very friendly with Angelo Bruno. They were often seen at dinner together. So starting in the 1920s, Miami was always kind of an open city. Because, the 1920s, the Tampa Mafia wasn't strong enough to be reaching across the state. They weren't big enough. So different guys like Lansky and stuff started a beachhead in Miami. And as Miami grew, the Trafficantes became involved. And like you said, by the 1950s, almost every family had started a presence down there and really, really hit its height from the 60s through the 70s. So Trafficante was seen definitely as one of kind of the people paid respect to him. They didn't have to kick up to him, but they would, hey, if they were coming down, he was seen. You can read the surveillance reports in the 1960s. He was with everyone from Chicago to Pittsburgh to New York.
Mm-hmm.
You would see Trafficante out and about. He was hitting the nightlife. North Bay Village was a real hot spot, which is it's a separate municipality, but it's in between mainland uh, Miami-Dade County and kind of the North Miami Beach area, and that little spit of land was a huge hotbed for crime figures from all over the United States, and Trafficante was seen at a lot of those bars quite a bit. So there's a long-winded answer saying yes, they all work together a lot, and
Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
I just wanted to showcase that there's a lot more than just the Tampa mob in Florida. Florida was a fairly complex, uh, state when it came to, having different families down there, and talking about surveillance reports in Santo himself. I mean, I saw surveillance reports talking about him as far away as like San Diego. Like, he's bouncing all over the country. He had connections. It sounded like, in not just like passing connections, deep rooted friendships with people all over the country. Which he had to have started developing those in order for them to be as strong as they were by the 50s and 60s, much earlier, right? So I do think that there's some validity to the fact that he was truly trained well for the life. So he shows up in 1957 as one of the people at the Appalachian meeting. In fact, if you've watched the movie Alto Nights, although I don't feel like they cast Santo very well, they definitely reference him as one of those arrested. You see him getting arrested out on the road by by the local police as De Niro kind of drives by, playing the Frank Costello part. So I guess tell us about Trafficante's involvement in Appalachian.
Yeah, so he flew up there. He flew up there from Miami, and he used the nickname Luis Santos. So if you look at the original arrest report, he's called Luis Santos, is the name he gave them, of Havana, Cuba. That's how they reference him. Excuse me, in the original report, which of course comes back as Santo Trafficante. So that kind of illustrates how he was recognized as the boss of one of the families. So they called him up to the big meeting.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but he was, the reason for the meeting was the Albert Anastasia assassination and the ascension of Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino. And Santo was already in the area a couple of weeks earlier when Anastasia was murdered. He was staying in the same hotel the day of that murder. Was that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, and he had dinner with Anastasia a couple nights earlier, and Joe DiMaggio, the baseball player, was at the dinner with them as well. And he was subpoenaed by the New York DA's office for the Anastasia hit and for Appalachian. So yeah, he was a suspect for a while. I don't. He had nothing to do with it. It was really internal Gambino family stuff. But I wouldn't be surprised if he was kind of given a heads up that something was going to go on, or. But yeah, that's just a weird coincidence. He is, and
yeah, he got the hell out of there
again,
right away.
Nobody, if you were to look at the hotel register, he registered under the nickname B, the letter B, and last name Hill was his alias.
Hill, yeah, I've heard that. So Appalachian happens, and of course, everybody's outed, right? As their true identity. Cosa Nostra is real. The FBI finally is forced to admit it. And although nobody, everybody's brought in to answer questions, everybody just so happened to be there to see their sick friend, Joe Barbara. Nobody really does any serious time as a result of Appalachian. There are some guys that do a little bit of time for contempt, maybe a year here, 2 years there. But really nothing comes of it other than like, well, now he's on the radar. He's on the national radar. And as a result, a certain group of brothers are coming up at that time, who I think everybody will know, the Kennedys. And so, as part of the Inquisition to Appalachian and all these guys being discovered, there start to be hearings, right? Bobby Kennedy, John Kennedy, and others. I believe they were the McClellan hearings, which had several iterations, and so people start to be outed and called before these committees. And at a certain point, Trafficante gets involved with the Kennedys because John wants to be elected president. So can you tell us a little bit about how that relationship started with, and what Trafficante's part in this national scheme to that the mafia concocted, or that a lot of people believe that they helped Kennedy get elected?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a lot to tie him to, those theories. Really, where Trafficante's involvement with the Kennedys comes in is when he's released from Cuban prison in '59 and he moves back to the U.S. He becomes involved with the CIA mafia plots against Castro. So
yeah, I almost forgot about that whole,
so
that whole
that's
thing.
kind of more that connection, because obviously the president knew what was going on. And Robert Kennedy, he's ramping up this war on the underworld on one hand, and then on the other hand, the CIA is asking Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli and Santo Trafficante, hey, help us get rid of Castro. Maybe you'll get your casinos back. So, yeah. I don't think we need to go down the rabbit hole of any conspiracy theories, but a lot of the talk about the mafia and their involvement with JFK comes from this kind of sense of betrayal, if you will, that whether it was they helped him get elected as a favor to Joe Kennedy, or, hey, we're helping the CIA get rid of a communist hostile regime 90 miles off the coast, and now you're coming down on our gambling business. So that kind of sense of betrayal. And I don't know if you'll want to go there yet, but I can just kind of jump into the Kennedy thing real quick if you wanted to kind of leapfrog into there. So right before he passes in 1987, Santo Trafficante supposedly has a conversation with his lawyer when he says, hey, we made a mistake. We should have killed Bobby Kennedy and not John Kennedy. And his lawyer, Frank Regano, wrote it in a book. And that, a lot of people say that's when Trafficante got tied to the Kennedy assassination. But if you go all the way back to the Warren Commission, Trafficante, it kind of circles around a lot of the conspiracy theories with Kennedy. A lot of it ties to the fact that he was working with the CIA on these anti-Castro activities. I think it's probably well beyond, I don't have another 5 hours to go down the rabbit hole, but I'll give your listeners or your viewers a one tidbit that they can go down, is that when Trafficante was in Cuban prison in 1959, he was visited there allegedly. Well, we know he was there at the same time, and I talked to another prisoner who was in the prison who saw it, that he was visited by Jack Ruby in Cuban prison in '59. So you take that and go down the rabbit holes, because there's a lot of
that's a hell of a rabbit hole. And so we almost skipped over the whole the Bautista and the Castro thing. I don't know why I skipped over that, because that is a pretty significant element of the Trafficante story. Right. So, he even gets to the point where they put him in prison, and he is allegedly, and you tell me if this is true or not, on the list to be executed, and very much in fear for his life. They thought Castro, I'm terrible with names. They thought Castro was going to play ball. Castro gets in there. He wins this revolution. He takes over, and he double crosses them. And so, the mafia, they lose everything. And so Santo, more so than anybody else, I felt like, was under pain of death, quite literally, as a result of being just thrown into prison.
Yeah, yeah. But really, the other thing too is they may have said they were gonna, that he was slated for death, but I think that was just kind of a bargaining chip for the Castro regime because they let him out of prison to attend his daughter's wedding. If they were going to execute him, they probably wouldn't have done that. And there's a lot of theories about how Trafficante got released from prison. I think probably the most plausible is they paid a Castro. It was kind of a shakedown. Um,
Yeah.
so that was the only time Santo Trafficante Jr. ever spent any time in prison was in Cuba in 1959.
Yeah. So we bounced ahead to the Kennedy stuff, and for those listeners who have maybe new, I did an episode on the mafia and what they were talking about, what they were picked up on wiretaps all around the country saying allegedly about the Kennedys. And it was not good. Santo was definitely one of those. In his case, it was relayed by his, different lawyers over the years. Frank Regano, Ed Becker, were a couple. And I feel like their account of what was said has been called into questions. So I'll just say, hey, you have to question the legitimacy of what they reputed that Santo said. But I think it's fair to say that he did not have any strong positive feelings towards the Kennedys, and especially after JFK is assassinated. I think it's probably pretty accurate to say that most mob guys were happy that happened. And at that time, Santo has a pretty strong relationship. We'd be remiss if we didn't touch on it with the New Orleans boss, Carlos Marcello. So I guess the question I would ask is, how does that relationship develop and evolve over the course of time?
There's a very long, deep connection between New Orleans and Tampa's Sicilian communities. After the lynching in the late 1800s in Louisiana, a number of Sicilians moved over across to Tampa because it was another port city with a large Sicilian population that was growing. So that underworld connection extended, years and years of just working together during the Prohibition era. There were guys like Augustine Lazara, who was a very prominent Tampa mobster in the 40s and 50s. He was really good friends with Joe Marcello, who was Carlos's brother. So yeah, that really close connection with Tampa and New Orleans was the product of history. That's really how it developed.
And so Santo and Carlos are next seen together in 1966 when they are picked up as part of the La Stella restaurant raid. A lot of people like to call that Little Appalachian. But there's a very famous photo that contains both Santo, Carlos, Frank Regano, and a number of other mafioso as they're picked up meeting in 1966 in the La Stella restaurant. And I believe the subject, maybe you know more about it than me, but I believe one of the subjects was the New Orleans family, and who would eventually take over after Carlos was no longer the boss, and he obviously stayed as boss for a long time. And then of course also at that time Tommy Lucchese had just passed away, or was about to pass away of terminal cancer. And so I think they were all together discussing a succession plan in that regard as well. So it was a mini national meeting where definitely Trafficante and Marcello were both picked up together. Pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So as you get into the late 60s, the 70s, Trafficante is obviously the head of the family. There's a lot more going on within the family during that time, but Trafficante is still the guy. So how does he maintain control of the family into old age, and how does he what's his demise ultimately? What's the end of his story?
So yeah, throughout the 70s, he's still the boss of the family. There's a lot of some young guys up and coming. Some of his contemporaries start to pass. But he just has a lot of respect. He has the backing of all the other families, and he's kind of a laissez-faire boss. He doesn't really like, he doesn't have his like he doesn't micromanage his family. So I think anytime you have a mafia boss who's not a micromanager, it's probably pretty good. But the other thing is, it's kind of a weird thing with guys like Marcello, Trafficante, these bosses sometimes of these smaller families. He was almost kind of off doing his own thing, and the family was just kind of running over here. A perfect example is Miami in the 1970s. He had this group called the Cuban mob, who were these Cuban refugees that came over post Batista. And he kind of had his own little thing going on down in Miami, which was kind of divorced from what was going on in Tampa. So there's always a little bit of it was just an interesting kind of relationship there. But he moves back to Tampa in the 70s, and he's getting older. He's having some health issues. And then I would say probably things start to go south for him personally, and you start seeing the beginnings of kind of how the family is going to end up. Probably around the time of which people probably know from the movie, the Donnie Brasco case in the late 70s, early 80s. So Trafficante gets indicted in that. That never goes to trial. He gets indicted out of a RICO indictment out of Miami for shaking down the laborers' pension fund. But that never comes to fruition because his health really starts taking a turn in the early 80s. And he dies in March of 1987 after undergoing heart surgery in Houston. So he
he died on the operating table. Is that
it
correct?
was right during or right after that he passed away. But yeah, so he passed away in March of 87, and that's kind of how things go.
And there's a picture of him, speaking of the Donnie Brasco thing, a picture of him coming out of a meeting with Sonny Black Napolitano out of New York. So definitely a connection that maybe you wouldn't expect to have been made. But if you've seen the movie, you kind of have an idea that Sonny Black and Joe Pistone, aka Donnie Brasco, were kind of making a connection down here in Florida with a fake restaurant and casino. So there's a guy from law enforcement who becomes, during this time period, pretty legendary for his pursuit and battle against the Trafficantes and against the mafia down here. So guy's name is Richard Cloud. Can you describe Richard Cloud and just talk a little bit about him and kind of where he fits into all of this?
Yeah, so he was a Tampa vice cop, pretty incorruptible Tampa vice cop in a department that still had some pretty deep strains of corruption. And he really was targeting kind of some of the lower level organized crime associates and guys in Tampa. They were running drugs out of the strip clubs. They were trafficking marijuana. And actually, a few years ago, it came out because Angelo Badami Jr. mentioned it, that when Richard Cloud was going after his brother, that the mob really started turning the pressure back on him. Now, he was a cop, but in a weird turn of events, he gets fired from the police department on supposedly trumped up charges from a lot of people I've heard. And there's some corruption, as I mentioned, in the police department. So he gets fired, and then not soon thereafter, he's at his house. He gets a knock on the door. There's a guy there with like a box of flowers, and there's a gun in there, and they shoot and kill him on his front porch. And that really starts to turn the tide in terms of this law enforcement effort against organized crime, because now they really do a full court press, and they end up eventually arresting the gunmen and start unraveling kind of the conspiracy and all the big players. And it never goes up to Trafficante, but it does go up to Frank Diecidue, the longtime underboss of the family, who gets kind of picked up in an ancillary RICO case to that. So that late 70s era in the post Richard Cloud, a lot of the lower level guys start getting targeted by law enforcement.
So that brings to mind an interesting point. And I think you see this in a couple of families right around this time, the 1980s, as the well-known heads of certain families around the country start to age and eventually pass away. Uh, there wasn't really a strong succession plan here. You see a very similar thing up in Providence with Raymond Patriarca Sr. Obviously, his son Raymond Jr. takes over, and all hell breaks loose because he I don't believe had planned for his son to take over. And I think a similar thing uh, happens here. All hell doesn't break loose in Tampa, but there wasn't a strong succession plan. And it really surprised me that one of the brothers, Enrico, Henry Trafficante, Frank Trafficante, one of the brothers who, as I understand it, they didn't exactly have a good relationship with Santo for whatever reason. But it did surprise me that one of the brothers did not kind of take over when Trafficante Jr. died. Well, I guess, what are your thoughts about that particular aspect of it?
Yeah, well, Frank passes away in the early 70s, and then there's the three brothers left, Sam, Henry, and Fano. Um, it- and none of them really, whether they seemed to not want it or, they were getting older too at that point. So I think there was,
Yeah.
yeah, they just wouldn't have been the ones to be in line for that. And yeah, supposedly there was some bad blood between Santo and Henry towards the end. I'm not sure the where that stemmed from, but well, we know he was close to Fano. Fano shows up in a lot of the Donnie Brasco surveillance photos. But yeah, so when he passes away, none of his brothers step in to fill the leadership spot.
And so let's talk about a couple of the guys that do. We've mentioned one, although I don't know that he was ever official boss. Frank, Daddy Frank, Diecidue. And then the other guy that I believe is still alive, still out there, very old at this point, is a guy named Vincent LoScalzo. Is allegedly the reputed head of what remains of the Trafficante family. And I believe LoScalzo would be the one who stepped in as official boss after Trafficante. But you're the expert. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Like, what happens in terms of the family's hierarchy when Santo dies?
Yeah, so Frank Deitchedu's a longtime underboss, but he doesn't really step up either. He's getting older too. He passes away in '94. Um, where's I going in the train of thought? Oh, Vince Lascalzo. So Vince Lascalzo also shows up in the Donnie Brasco case because he's Trafficante's driver. Drives him to a couple meetings with Sonny Black. And according to state, local, federal law enforcement, and actually maybe even that evening, Lascalzo kind of assumes the role, the evening of Trafficante's funeral, assumes the role of boss. And he is the alleged boss. He took over the family in 1987. He's still alive. Probably hasn't done anything criminal in decades. Hasn't been active in a very, very long time. Um, but yeah, he shows up on law enforcement's radar in a few different areas. He's seen with Joe Marcello in New Orleans. He's seen with mobsters out in Texas and California. He's seen at the wedding of some Sicilian mobsters in New York. So he's kind of making the rounds. But he steps into a family that's a lot different. It's smaller. A lot of the older guys are dying. Uh, the young guys are getting involved in more white collar crime. It's really kind of shifting and changing. So by the mid '90s, almost all of that older group of guys are gone. So there's only a handful of guys left really, both in Tampa, and they still have a faction in Miami that's operating. But yeah, so he takes over family, but it's a smaller, less kind of a put together outfit, if you will.
And how big would you say, at its height, how many members do you think that the Tampa family had?
Probably between 40 and 50 guys. give or take, and then a couple hundred associates. Yeah.
Um, and then one other question that kind of came to mind. Well, the reason there's a family in Tampa, to begin with, is that there was a large Italian population, and like a lot of other cities, right, the Italians eventually move out, and the area becomes to some degree gentrified. Um, what happens in Tampa? Is it a similar story there, where the Italian population just doesn't isn't as significant as time goes on?
Not really, because most of the it's native Tampanos or Tampanians, depends on which one you want to.
Mm-hmm.
Most of they stay here. I know many fourth, fifth generation, Tampa residents,
Interesting.
a number Italian, a number Cuban Italian, which they say is like the mixed marriage of old Ybor. But really, yeah, Ybor City stops becoming kind of a residential neighborhood in the 1960s, kind of goes to urban renewal. People move out to the suburbs, but the suburbs down here are still kind of close around
Mm-hmm.
Tampa. So you have one of the things I like about Tampa is you have a really good well of history going back, where people are, like I said, fourth, fifth generation have lived in the area, have lived in the city. So yeah, the Italian community isn't as centered, but there's still a lot of the relatives that live around the area. And in fact, the old Italian club in Ybor City, which was founded in the late 1800s, the building it's over 100 years old. It's still a very active club, a social club, and they have all big events all the time. So it's the Italian community here is still very, very strong, as is the Cuban and Spanish immigrant community. The descendants of the original immigrants to the area.
Interesting. So let me take the question another way. So one of the reasons for outside of in other areas, the Italian presence not being so significant and having other groups kind of move in and take over, that doesn't seem to be the case in Tampa. But one of the other ways that families decline is the crop of second, third, fourth generation Italians coming up no longer desire or need to go into that kind of lifestyle. And so, well, when you don't have a crop of new and fresh recruits, the need for a mafia family just isn't as prevalent. And I do get the sense that happened in Tampa, where maybe they just didn't have the recruiting pool over the course of time as the family aged. Would you say that part's
Yeah,
accurate?
absolutely, absolutely. And I say this with all due respect to my law enforcement friends. Law enforcement did a lot to dent their operations, but
Yes.
it wasn't law enforcement that killed the mafia in Tampa. It was time. Like you said, it's attrition, and the young guys coming up today. There's way more opportunities than there were back in the early 1900s. So
Yeah.
yeah, no, you're spot on with that assessment.
Yeah, and I always you hear the saying, "Hard times make hard men," and when a lot of the Italians came over here in the early days, they didn't have a lot of choices,
Exactly.
right? They were just as discriminated against as many of the other ethnic groups, and so they had to go to crime. Like that was their way out. And like you said, nowadays, people just have more options. There's no need to go into crime. And not only that, with the advent of RICO and the other laws, and of course with technology and phones, it just doesn't make any sense. You're not going to get away with anything without facing a significant prison sentence. So, while we all love the movies and people like me love the history, the reality is that it's just within the Italian subculture no longer a super viable lifestyle as it was in the 50s and 60s. Um, so let's put a pin in the Trafficante family. How how did they evolve throughout the 90s, and kind of what do you feel like is the state today? Are they still around? Are they still kicking around and doing
No,
things?
there hasn't been any significant activity in 20 years, really. So the last major case was October of 2000, and that was the Miami faction led by Steve Raffa. But there hasn't been a mafia tied case in over 20 years here in Tampa. And the few remaining guys are all in their late 80s. They're not out there.
Yeah, they're not making
Yeah,
any new members, so it'll be like the Buffalinos where they just let
yeah,
it
it's
die out.
just
I think there are going to be
fade
a lot of
away.
families outside of the main, New York and Chicago that just
Yeah,
die out.
absolutely. There's been families that have died out from the beginning. I mean, Newark, Birmingham, Alabama died out in the 20s, but yeah, some of these smaller families, like you alluded to earlier, it doesn't have that recruiting pool, so they kind of fade away.
So, what are you currently working on? What do you got coming up? I think the listeners will love to hear it.
Yeah, so my most recent book I just turned into the publisher a few weeks ago is a book about Jerry Katina, who was I don't know the best way to describe him, the most successful legitimate businessman in the mafia. Like he probably made more money legitimate business than he did in organized crime. But he was the acting and then official boss of the Genovese family,
Yeah,
heavily New Jersey based, a lot of ties to Vegas, a lot of ties to some pretty significant companies. So I kind of go through his life, his impact both in the underworld and in the business world, and kind of trace that, try to do a little bit of a deep dive into some Genovese family leadership, and kind of, I don't say bust and miss, but kind of try to offer a more tangible look at some of the leadership positions, because it's a family that's notorious for not really knowing who's the real boss. But yeah, so that'll be out
yeah.
in March of 2026.
And yeah, excited to read that one. Especially want to read about the state of the family in the '60s, because, like you said, really tough to decide who exactly was the boss, and then of course when Vito Genovese dies in 1969, ever since that point they've done a really great job of hiding who the true boss really was. So definitely some interesting stuff. For me, I'm definitely excited to read it in relation to the connection and interest in the Tommy Eboli story. And I know Eboli and Katina had a pretty close and sometimes contentious relationship, but a pretty close relationship nonetheless. So very excited to read about that. Um, so Scott, thank you for coming on.
For having me.
Great discussion. Very good deep dive for the Trafficantes. Is there anywhere besides your new book that you want to point people to before we drop?
Yeah, tampamafia.com. You can find all my information writings. We do a walking tour of Tampa for September to May. So if you're in the Tampa area, check us out, and you can find some articles and information on the mob in Tampa, and some swag if you're interested. So tampamafia.com.
Yeah, I've heard of the walking tour. I do want to come and do that at some point if I'm ever down in Tampa. I never have visited. Been in Florida plenty of times and have never visited Tampa, but it's someplace that I mean to get to at some point, and would love to do the walking tour. I'm a huge fan of history, if you can't tell, and that would be definitely of interest to me. So let's go ahead and close the episode. As I end every episode, or at least as I've been ending my episodes more recently. Until next time, may your troubles be light, but your envelopes heavy. Goodbye, everybody.